Good morning. Welcome to the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. My name is Svetlana Beckman, and I will be the moderator for today's program. Due to COVID-19, our programs are virtual for the time being. We want to keep everyone safe and healthy. And of course, we very much look forward to resuming our in-person gatherings when the time is right. For those who are new to the Society, we are a self-governing, inclusive, caring community for those who seek a rational, compassionate philosophy of life without regard to belief or non-belief in a supreme being. We focus on the ethical values that bring people together, not on the beliefs that keep people apart. In the spirit of intellectual, philosophical, and artistic freedom, we come together to explore life, nature, and the universe. Like traditional religious communities, we celebrate births, conduct wedding ceremonies, and host memorial services. Through our Golden Rule Sunday School, we teach our kids humanist principles, religious literacy, and critical thinking. We staff soup kitchens, pack lunches for the homeless, watch movies, write fiction, and visit ethnic restaurants. And yes, many, or at least some of these activities, including the Sunday School, are still taking place, albeit virtually. Our Sunday morning programs give us an opportunity to learn about a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts, and the sciences, to name just a few. And today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming on religion. So the chat box will be open during the entire program, but don't feel that you need to be filling it up right now or in the course of the program. Just relax and listen. There will be plenty of time later for Q&A when you'll be able to pose your questions and the speaker will be able to answer them. And our speaker today is Robert Jones. He is a founder and CEO of the Public Religious Research Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization conducting research on issues at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. He has a PhD in religion from Emory University and a Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Today, Robert will discuss his new book, White Too Long: The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I'm only sad that I can't be there in person, but I am happy that you all are carrying on virtually and keeping everyone safe, as you said. So thanks so much for hosting me this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about my new book and kind of lay out kind of the main contours of the book. And then hopefully we'll have time for a very rich discussion. And actually the back and forth and question and answer period is usually my favorite part of the discussion. But first I'll spend a few minutes kind of just laying out kind of what the book's about, why I wrote the book, and what you can expect between the covers. So I'll start with just a little bit about kind of how the book's constructed. It's a little bit of a different book for me. Most of the time I wear my social science hat at PRRI and looking day in, day out at public opinion data around religion, culture, and politics. But this book it certainly is grounded in social science, but it's also somewhat personal. In fact, it's the first personal book that I've ever written. And so it blends memoir with social science and history, kind of holding all of that together. And basically it tells the repressed and hidden story of the centuries-long entanglement of white supremacy and American Christianity. And also tries to examine how this explains the fault lines we're seeing at this current moment of racial reckoning in the country. So as a way of kind of structuring, I'm going to take each of these in turn. The personal piece of this kind of set you up to know where I stand in my own personal history with in relationship to these questions. And then I'll get into the social science, what current public opinion data tells us about this entanglement between American Christianity and white supremacy. And then a bit about some historical touch points that kind of help make sense of all of this. So, I'll start with the personal. The opening quote of the book, I try to go straight at it. And this is the first line of the book. The Christian denomination in which I grew up was founded on the proposition that chattel slavery could flourish alongside the gospel of Jesus Christ. Its founders believed this arrangement was not just possible, but also divinely mandated. Now, I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up predominantly in Jackson, Mississippi, as a Southern Baptist. And I was that kid. I was at church all the time growing up. My family was heavily involved in the church. And even as an adolescent, I was often at church 4 to 5 times a week. Virtually every time the doors were open, anytime something was going on in the youth group, I was there. I also went to a Baptist college. I went to Mississippi College. And yet it wasn't until I was actually in graduate school and seminary that I heard anything about the white supremacist roots of our denomination. I knew the creation myth from the book of Genesis, but I didn't know anything about the genesis of my own denomination. And that was that in 1845, Baptists were across the country were in a kind of standoff around the issue of slavery. And as a test case, the Baptist churches in the South put forward a candidate to be a missionary who was a slave owner. And the question was put very squarely, and the Northern Baptists rejected it. And then Baptists in the South, who again thought this was perfectly compatible, that a minister and a member of the clergy could enslave people, basically took their toys and went home, formed their own denomination at that point, and hence the name Southern Baptist Convention. It was literally the Baptist churches in the South supporting slavery and supporting the Confederacy. Again, out of all the times I attended Sunday school, all the sermons I heard, nothing did I know about this history until I was in my early 20s. I'd heard some things about Martin Luther King and the important role of African American churches, that organizing the civil rights movement, but I had learned nothing about the really critical role that white churches and leaders played in protecting this white supremacist status quo, resisting desegregation, and resisting the civil rights movement. I saw private Christian schools all around me in Mississippi growing up, but I didn't understand anything about or the fact that most of them were in fact founded as segregation academies. That is, private schools for white kids to go as they fled the public schools as they were being desegregated after Brown v. Board of Education. This one actually was quite personal to me as well. So I was actually in elementary school in the 1970s, early 1970s, when the first Black kids showed up at our all-white public school. And given that's nearly 20 years after Brown v. Board of Education, and so it took Mississippi drug its feet that long before finally desegregating the schools. But even as I was experiencing this, our churches said nothing about this, didn't explain it, didn't talk about the history. There would have been a great opportunity there. Again, heard nothing about it. So really, this goes straight to the motivations for writing the book. And that is really to break this silence in a serious way, and to really understand, both for myself and my fellow white Christians, how the centuries-long commitment to a social order that protected and nourished white lives at the expense of Black lives and indigenous peoples here in the country has been incorporated into the very fabric of American Christianity. And I think one big reveal of the book is that this is true not only of the Southern branch of Christianity, of which I'm a part, but what the current public opinion data reveals, we'll cover in a minute, shows that this commitment to white supremacy was very much entrenched in, for example, the white mainline Protestant denominations, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Methodists, that were really much more populous in the Midwest. And it's also true of white Catholics who have their own history of discrimination, and yet you can still see this legacy, and you can see it in the history just under the surface, even among white Catholics, which of course are more numerous in urban areas and even in the Northeast. So it really is an effort to uncover and cast some light on this neglected and repressed history, and just with this conviction that it's just well past time for white Christians to find the courage to tell the truth. I read a lot of James Baldwin in working on this book, and one I think thing that stayed with me in terms of motivation at the beginning, and I'll cover it. In fact, the title of the book comes from a Baldwin quote that I'll get to later. But in terms of motivations, there was this very basic quote. Many of you may know. He said, "Not everything that can be faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So one big purpose, I think, of the book is to just, again, cast light on it, put the truth about our history out there with the goal of having it be something that can finally, after hundreds of years of denial, be faced. So the thesis, you kind of go straight at it here of the book, is this, that a close read of history and also looking contemporary public opinion data today reveals that white Christians have not just been complacent or complicit, but rather as the nation's dominant cultural power and source of moral legitimation, we have constructed and sustained a project of perpetuating white supremacy that has framed the entire American story. And the legacy of this unholy union still lives in the DNA of white Christianity today. And again, not just among white evangelical Protestants in the South, but also among white mainline Protestants in the Midwest and Catholics in the Northeast. So what does the current public opinion data say about this? And then we'll get to history after that. So as I said, my week in, week out work is as the founder and executive director of the Public Religion Research Institute here in Washington, D.C. And so we're looking, on a weekly basis at shifting public opinion across a whole range of data. And we've been paying a lot of attention to questions around race, racism, and particularly around the existence of structural racism. In other words, not just personal bad, ill feelings toward a member of another race or ethnicity, but more a kind of consent or approval of the way that society is set up to really benefit whites in particular at the expense of other people of color in the country. And what we found really was that across the board, and one thing we did is we compared in the analysis, I compared whites who identify as Christian with whites who do not identify with any religious affiliation. So kind of using that group of white non-Hispanic Americans as a kind of a control to compare white non-Hispanic Christians to. And one of the things that I found there is there's this enormous gap between that really is a kind of white Christian gap between, again, whites who identify as Christian, whites who identify with no religious tradition. And what we find is consistently that whites who are Christian are consistently more likely than whites who are religiously unaffiliated to deny the existence of structural racism. Just to give you a couple of examples here, on the issue that we've been seeing all summer long, becoming so prominent, it's been with us for quite some time, but becoming very prominent, is the killing of unarmed Black men by police. And we've been asking questions about this since 2015. And we see the same pattern over and over, survey after survey. And so our question asks whether people see the killing of unarmed Black men by police as isolated incidents, or do they see them as part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans? And on this question, white Christians, again, whether it's white evangelicals, white mainline, or white Catholics, are all about 25 percentage points more likely than whites who claim no religious affiliation to say that the killing of unarmed Black men by police are merely isolated incidents. That is, they don't connect the dots between these events. We also asked about the Confederate flag, Confederate monuments, very similar patterns here. White Christians of all kinds are at least 30 percentage points more likely than whites who claim no religious affiliation to say that the Confederate flag is more a symbol of Southern pride than a symbol of racism. And even when we went back in the field, so the book uses data from 2018 and 2019, and we went back in the field this summer after the killing of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officers, and asked these questions again. And even after this kind of broke into the national consciousness, there have been protests across the country, that these attitudinal patterns still persist, even in the wake of the protests and the kind of more consciousness raising over the summer. So lest they be kind of accused of cherry picking data, one of the things I did in the book is I constructed a larger index of questions. So in fact, 15 different questions. Those two questions are part of this index that are designed to get, again, beyond personal biases to include perceptions of structural injustice. And I created these into what I call a racism index. It's a composite scale of questions that notably correlate quite highly with one another. That is, if you answer one way on one question, you're very likely to answer the same way on other questions in there. And they cover a lot of ground. So they cover attitudes about Confederate symbols. They cover African-American economic mobility and limits, perceptions of limits to economic mobility and inequality. They cover the treatment of African-Americans in policing and the criminal justice system, and then a number of questions of just general perceptions of race and racism and the continued existence of racial discrimination. And so even putting all those questions together into kind of a big composite index, it really just makes this pattern actually even clearer. So again, compared to whites who claim no religious affiliation, white Christians overall register higher median scores on this racism index. And the differences between white Christian subgroups like white evangelicals, mainline, and white Catholics are actually largely differences of degree rather than kind. So for example, I standardized the scores on this index and scored it 1 out of 10, with 10 holding the most racist attitudes. It may not be a big surprise that white evangelicals who are concentrated in the South scored 8 out of 10 on this racism index. But it probably will surprise you to know that white mainline Protestants, again, this is the National Council of Churches crowd, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, United Methodists, scored 7 out of 10 on this same scale. And white Catholics also scored 7 out of 10 on this scale. And if you look at whites who claim no religious affiliation, they only score 4 out of 10 on the scale. African Americans score 2 out of 10, just for a reference point. So again, there's like, this kind of at a scale of 1 to 10, there's a difference between 4 and 7 here on this racism scale. And it worked. And actually, I did a number of statistical tests on this to kind of make sure these weren't spurious correlations, put them into regression models, controlled for all kinds of other variables. And even with controlling for, so, trying to answer the question, well, maybe it's because they're more likely to be Republican, or maybe it's more likely that they're more likely to live in a rural area rather than an urban area, or maybe it is about region, or maybe it's about education level. So even putting in controls for all of these other possible explanatory factors, this independent relationship between holding more racist attitudes and white Christian identity stands up, and there is no relationship when you put it into a statistical model. There's no relationship between whites who claim no religious affiliation and holding more racist attitudes. So it's a quite robust relationship, even with a lot of controls in place. And then also, you can actually, when I flip the correlation around and try to look at, okay, well, if holding racist attitudes predicts very robustly identifying as white and Christian, is that true? Is the obverse true? And so flipping it around, it turns out that it is, that being affiliated with a white Christian group is independently associated with an approximately 10% increase in racist attitudes. And that's, again, controlling for partisanship, controlling for region, education level, et cetera. And again, there's no significant relationship between those who hold no religious identity and holding racist attitudes. And then the last thing I checked here is this question about how much a closer connection to a church made. So I think there might be the objection that, for example, maybe this is just true of Christians in name only, people who just claim to be Christian but haven't been formed, or kind of haven't gone through any kind of religious formation or discipleship inside of a Christian church. And it turns out that even when I check church attendance and look at the difference between those who attend, say, weekly or more, and those who attend much less, at best, there's no difference. That is, the strong connection between holding more racist attitudes and identifying as a white Christian stands up both among those who attend more frequently and among those who attend less frequently. And in fact, if you look just at white evangelical Protestants, the denomination I grew up, or the kind of family I grew up in, actually what we find is that attending religious services more often makes one hold more racist views, not less. So in other words, the strength of the relationship between holding racist attitudes and identifying as a white evangelical is actually stronger among those who attend more often than it is among those who attend less often. So it's a quite robust relationship that I find, even with a lot of controls in place, and even looking at things like attendance patterns. What this tells you really is that the Christian part of that identity is in fact doing the work there. In other words, one way of thinking about this is if you take your average white person and you add Christian identity, it's likely they will hold more racist attitudes than less, and they move further away from the attitudes of African Americans than nearer to them. One other way, just kind of sum this up, is to say among whites, which group holds attitudes that are closer to African American attitudes on these issues of structural racism? And the answer is whites who claim no religious affiliation, rather than whites who claim to be Christian. So that's kind of where we are in the current public opinion data. And again, this has stood up even when we've done some follow-up surveys this summer at PRRI here. So I'm going to shift for the last part of the talk to history, and to kind of help us think a little bit about history and how we got here. And I'm just going to kind of give a couple of punctuating examples. And what I'm going to start with is actually, again, quite personal. Part of the way I tell the story here is to kind of follow my own family's trajectory. I've inherited my family Bible from my mother's side, which is the Bible's dated at 1815 and contains 200 years of my family's or the origins of what is now 200 years of my family's history, all in Middle Georgia. So this was the first generation that actually settled in Middle Georgia around Macon and Twiggs and Bibb County, Georgia. And so I kind of go back to Macon. Both my parents grew up in Macon. In fact, I'm the first generation not to live in Macon in 200 years. So I went back there and looked at the parent church, First Baptist Church in Macon, that was founded in 1825. And that church, I think if you kind of take a look at what worship looked like inside that church when it was founded, was not atypical for Protestant and Catholic churches across the country. And that is that what you had was white slave owners bringing enslaved people to church with them. And whites sat up front. And in this church, they put enslaved African Americans in the back of the church. And other churches, they actually constructed, you may have seen this, special what they called slave galleries. They were actually called this, that they were balconies in the church built so that whites would sit on the main floor and enslaved Africans would sit in the balconies. And this was common practice, and they were counted as members of the church. But if you take that general setting, very, very seriously, and just start asking the questions, well, what kind of sermons could get preached, in a setting like that? What kind of prayers could get prayed? What kind of scripture, which passages of scripture would get read? Which ones would not get read? In those settings, you begin to see that the lived experience of white Christianity in the churches had this a priori commitment in the South to slavery, but even in the Northeast and the Midwest, it had this a priori commitment to white supremacy. That is, that whites were literally a superior race, and that was by divine design, right? Not just coincidental, but there was actually a theological construct put under this, and ways that the Bible was read to support this view. But this was the normative view, really, for most of American Christianity. So whatever theology developed, whatever practices developed around this a priori commitment to white supremacy. And white evangelicals, it's a pretty straight read with their heavy support of the Confederacy in the South, resistance to civil rights. I won't spend a lot more time there, but I'll flag a couple of things among white mainline Protestants. Again, this is usually thought of as the more progressive part. Most of them, but here's worth noting that virtually every mainline Protestant denomination split over the issue of slavery in the Civil War. So Methodist split, Presbyterian split, the Episcopalian split, and then many of them came back together sometime in the 20th century. The Baptists never came back together, but the other groups have come together. Some as late as, like the Presbyterians didn't reconcile till the 1980s, for example, the Methodists in the early part of the 20th century, and the Episcopalians as well. But what was notable is that while they split over the issue of slavery, there was never actually a big divide on the issue of white supremacy. And this was something actually that was, I think, became clear to me that I was not actually that clear on until I really started doing research to the book and reading like Frederick Douglass, for example, who was dismayed that after the bloodshed of the Civil War, that many whites could just very quickly come back together and start mending the fences. And that what he discovered very quickly is that while there had been this great divide over slavery, that the question of white supremacy was quite separate from the issue of slavery and easily survived the Civil War. And one example that I think will make this clear is from leading Presbyterian minister Charles Finney, who was an abolitionist, very vocal abolitionist, and also a very popular, preacher in New York. But while he was an abolitionist, after the Civil War, he nonetheless defended a kind of segregation, particularly in church bodies. And so he had a younger protege, for example, that was actually making plans to integrate religious services. And Finney stopped him in his tracks, and he said this: "You err in supposing the principle of abolition and amalgamation are identical. Abolition is a question of flagrant and unblushing wrong, a direct and outrageous violation of fundamental right. The other is a question of prejudice that does not necessarily deprive any man of any positive right." Now, this is from one of the most staunch advocates of abolition and working very, very furiously to abolish slavery, but yet the sense that it didn't put African Americans on equal footing, even inside of churches, much less in society. And this continues on. Among white Catholics, as I mentioned, they had a very different experience. There was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment that lasted really all the way up through the 20th century. Even John F. Kennedy, of course, when he ran in 1960, was plagued with a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. But what's notable here is that this did not allow Catholics to escape, I think, really being infected with and committing themselves to white supremacy here. And in fact, the Catholic tradition all the way back to the 15th century with the Doctrine of Discovery in 1493 really carries this forward. I mean, that was an edict by a Catholic Pope saying, look, it gave basically explorers and missionaries permission to just occupy land by force, that they encountered any peoples who were not Christian. They were then authorized to take that on behalf of the church and the states they were working for. And again, of course, this mostly operated against non-European people of color. And that came with them to the US as well. And so one just example of this, in my home state, I live in Maryland now, in my current home state of Maryland. If you go back to late 18th century Maryland, 1/5 of those included in a Catholic census were enslaved people owned by white Catholics or by white Catholic institutions. And when W.B. Du Bois was looking around at the state of religion and racism in the country, he didn't really mince any words about what he saw not only in Protestant churches, but in Catholic churches, and had this to say about the Catholic Church. Quote, "The Catholic Church in America stands for color separation and discrimination to a degree equaled by no other church in America, and that is saying a lot." Urban Catholic parishes in major cities of New York, again, way outside the South, were segregating African Americans into single parishes, or even when they were allowed to worship in the same church, as late as the 1940s, were requiring Black members to sit in the back, as these other Protestant practices were, and approach the altar last to receive the Eucharist. And it came to a head really in 1968. The National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus, there weren't that many of them, African American priests, but formed a coalition to kind of call this out, and said this in 1968. Again, these are Catholic priests saying this about their own institution. The Catholic Church in the U.S. is primarily a white racist institution, has addressed itself primarily to white society, and is definitely a part of that society. And even as late as 2004, and this is after multiple statements from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, it's really clear that this doesn't get down to the level of, and those statements were denouncing racism, calling on reforms, but these didn't really get down to the local parish priests or to people in the pews. There was a very notable survey done in 2004 of American Catholics. And in 2004, 2/3 of Catholics said they had not heard a single sermon on racism or racial justice in the previous 3 years as they were working through the entire lectionary. So that means that the way this works, right, in a 3-year period, you read through the entire canon, Christian canon, both Hebrew text and the New Testament. And so in 3 years of reading through every verse in the Bible, that 2/3 of Catholic priests had not found a single occasion to preach a sermon on racism or racial justice. So, in these kind of seedbeds of American Christianity that kind of go far beyond whatever statements were issued by official denominational bodies, but sort of looking at how practice is really developed on the ground, we really do see this presumption of white supremacy distorting and disfiguring American Christianity really from the beginning, and highly influencing not only theology but practices there. And in the book, I kind of point this out and say, look, it may be obvious to many mainstream white Christians today that they should denounce slavery or segregation or even overt declarations of white supremacy, and denounce these as antithetical to the teachings of Jesus. And in fact, I've gotten a lot of those kinds of comments, that it's obvious that Christianity is there. But the truth of the matter is that this is really only very recent and only partially conscious, I think, for most white American Christians and churches, both Protestant and Catholic. And the unsettling truth, if we can face it, is that for nearly all of American history, white Christians conjured a light-skinned Jesus that was not merely indifferent to the status quo of racial inequality, but he actually demanded its defense and its preservation as part of a worldview, as part of a kind of divinely ordained order of things. And the other thing I think, sort of in writing the book, I became clear was that although we have this history and it's just barely under the surface, it doesn't take much to surface it, even though it's heavily denied and a lot of energy spent not dealing with it. It's right there. It's very clear. And what's also clear is that there's hardly been really any movement to reform white Christian theology, white Christian hymns. All of that stuff is like very easily just kind of passed down and inherited. There has not been a great reckoning, I think, with this history in a way that would require a very serious reconstruction. So, I think one thing that I have heard, I think, from many white Christians really facing this history for the first time is, dismay, right? And kind of, how can this be? But, what becomes clear, I think, when you take a hard look at the history, when you see these contemporary public opinion attitudes, rather than being kind of dismayed or surprised, I think the question really moves from how can this be to, given this history, how could it in fact be otherwise? So I want to close with just a couple of comments here. The book is not all doom and gloom. I do end with some signs of hopefulness, and specifically with some examples of some congregations, two in particular from Macon, Georgia, that are working to make a difference. In fact, it's that same congregation, First Baptist Church in Christ, that has this very difficult past and a shameful past of kind of defending slavery, and in fact promoting a Christianity where white Christian enslavers could feel quite fine with the status of their souls and the status of their religion while owning other human beings. And then what I go to at the end of the book is that in the last 7 years, though, that congregation has actually begun to build community with another First Baptist Church in Macon that is in fact made up of descendants of the enslaved people from that original combined church. And these two churches literally sit around the corner from each other in Macon, which is not a huge city to begin with. And for 150 years, they basically ignored each other's presence. But 7 years ago, they decided to come together and and basically the two pastors kind of, talk to each other. It's like, what are we doing here? We have this long shared history. It's very fraught, to be sure, but we should try to rebuild some community. And so they've started on really a covenanted relationship where they literally had a service, signed a covenant of kind of just going. They had not a real blueprint, but a commitment to going on this journey together. And it's been quite remarkable, I think, and particularly transformative. I think for both, but particularly for the white Christian church, which has had to face, I think, a lot of this buried, history. But one quick outcome I'll say is that they've been able to build enough trust that has really changed, I think, the perspective of particularly the white congregation. Just one example is that when Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida, the two churches were actually planning a joint youth trip, and with the youth from the predominantly black church and white church going on the same trip. And the white church noticed that no one from the none of the kids from the African American church had signed up, and they finally the white pastor talked to the African American pastor, said, well, hey, what's going on? And this was following the killing of Trayvon Martin. And the black pastor said, look, all of our parents are thinking our kids look just like Trayvon. We're not going to take a trip down to Florida. They were going to Disney World for New Year's. So we're not going to take our kids down to Florida in that context. We don't really feel comfortable with that. And they ended up, and this was something just not at all on the radar of the white parents, of course, but they ended up having to have this conversation about this, and really the white parents and the white chaperones came around, and in fact there was one person who was actually the DA of Bibb County said, look, I get it, I understand what you're saying. I am going to kind of commit myself to, like, my sole role on the trip is going to be to kind of watch the backs of our African American kids on the trip. And ultimately, they ended up going on the trip together. But it meant that there was a new kind of consciousness among the white group of just the kinds of, the conversation that that African American parents were having to have, that they were not. And this kind of changing of perspective. I can say a little bit more about this in the Q&A if you want to go a little bit further about their partnership. There's a number of other quite remarkable chapters in it, including them taking a joint trip to Montgomery, Alabama, to see the National Memorial for Justice and Healing, Peace, Justice, and Healing, which is set up to memorialize the more than 4,400 victims of lynching in the country. And they took a joint trip to do that, came back and had a joint worship service and kind of conversation about that experience. And so, one of the things I think this congregation has shown me, and other examples I talk about in the book, is that there is a path forward here, but it does take a lot of hard work, and that I think particularly for white congregations, the temptation has been that they want to make things better, but what they're really after is reconciliation, right? And another way I think of reading that is absolution, and a kind of quick one at that. And so one of the recommendations, sort of following some of the case studies in the book, that I point to is to sort of call on white Christians, yes, to do this work and to build communities and relationships where they can do this work on the ground, but not to reach for reconciliation, right? That really they should be focusing on repentance, which really calls on folks to do the work of repair and justice. And if they do that work of repair and justice, the work of reconciliation will in fact come as an organic outgrowth of that. But reaching directly for reconciliation, I think is sort of wrong-headed and often a quick shortcut, I think, for many white Christians to kind of move past the difficult and uncomfortable work of repair. The other thing I'll say in terms of hopefulness is that I turned in the manuscript about a year ago. And when I turned in the manuscript, I would not have imagined, the summer that we've had, and this, clearly coming to a public crossroads. So the question is being called on racial justice, and that this would be this front and center in our national conversation. I actually think, despite the challenges and the divisions and the difficulty, that this is actually a good thing, And that I want to call attention to just a couple of things that that I have seen that I think do give me some hope here. And one of these is I spent some time in Richmond doing a fair amount of research there. And when I was there just a year ago, I could walk down Monument Avenue, and there were these five massive statues and monuments to the Confederacy and to Confederate leaders there. Today, four of the five of those statues at the center of those monuments have been removed and torn down. And one of them, the one to Robert E. Lee, which is the oldest one, is kind of in a legal dispute over who has the right to remove it, but it is in fact slated for removal. And one kind of arc I'll give here is that there is a church, a Baptist church in Richmond that stands right across from the Stonewall Jackson Memorial. And when that memorial was being taken down, one of the members there asked if they could ring their historic bell as a kind of sign of solidarity of it being brought down. And they did that. So as the crane's taking the statue off, the bell at First Baptist Church is ringing there. That's really significant because of that church, first of all, was moved to that position to be across from Stonewall Jackson very intentionally. Like, it was literally moved from downtown to be out on Monument Avenue, literally to be in the shadow of that monument as a positive association. And as part of its kind of expression of this kind of tie between white supremacy, the Confederacy, and white Christianity. That bell that was given to ring also was in fact the same bell that the church during the Civil War had offered to the Confederacy to be melted down to make cannons. Now, that they didn't take it, so they still have this bell. But in fact, the congregation voted to offer this bell to the Confederacy to create cannons to defend the Confederacy and slavery. And the same bell rung this past summer to celebrate that monument coming down. One other quick example, and I'll wrap, is in my own home state of Mississippi. This summer, maybe you have seen this, that finally voted to remove the Confederate battle flag from our state flag. And this was something that I think is a surprise. I certainly wouldn't have anticipated this. But the other thing I wouldn't have anticipated is that one of the key cultural groups in the state that called on its removal was in fact the Mississippi Baptist Convention. And in fact, a former seminary colleague of mine is the president of the Mississippi Baptist Convention, and was the one who called. I was pleasantly surprised and got to watch him call for the removal of that, and call on the governor and the legislature to do it. And in fact, they've done that now. So there'll be very shortly a new Mississippi Baptist flag, our state flag there. So let me wrap with this. It's really clear that the country is, once again, and certainly not the first time in our history, but facing a particular moment of reckoning on racial justice. And as I see it, maybe the clearest one in my lifetime. And the question is really being called. And I think the message, of the book is that to kind of take a biblical image, that all across America, there's a great cloud of witnesses gathering to see whether we, white Christians in particular, who are responsible for building the legitimacy of white supremacy in American culture, can finally find the courage and the humility and love, really, to face the truth about our long relationship with white supremacy. And as we see these monuments to white supremacy falling, I think the question is whether white Christians will take the lead in dismantling the white supremacist worldview that was legitimized to erect them in the first place. And I'll close with a quote from Baldwin here. And he was, I think, very clear about the need to tell the truth, and that this was actually a starting point for healing, a starting point for rebalancing the scales, repairing the damage. And he had this to say in a piece he wrote nearly 50 years ago, that if we can find the courage and love to tell the truth, quote, we can end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. I'll leave it there with Baldwin.
Thank you so much. That is such a powerful topic, and I really look forward to the many to asking you the many questions that are gathering in the chat box. So we will have the Q&A in just a few minutes. Meanwhile, we're going to listen to a brief musical interlude and look at a slideshow of past society programs and collect donations. Contributions will be collected virtually at ethicalhumanistsociety.org/donate or with Zelle to donate@ethicalhuman.org. And I believe you will see a banner sort of running across your screen to repeat what I just told you. We suggest a donation of $5 and of course appreciate any amount that you're comfortable with. It is through our generosity that we show how meaningful the Sunday programs are. And we thank all of you who sustain the society with their donations of time and money. Welcome back. All right, let us start with the questions. I think I'll wait for Robert to be on screen again. Hi. Okay, first question. Oh my goodness, I really need to scroll back up here. What happens if you look at and query highly religious Hispanic Americans? What results do you find if you've done that research?
Yeah, among Hispanic Americans, what you find is a very big divide between Hispanic Catholics and Hispanic Protestants. Hispanic Protestants tend to be more evangelical in their outlook, and they tend to be more conservative. They're certainly not as conservative as white evangelicals are, but they're sort of like maybe in between. There's about a 20-point partisan difference between between Hispanic Catholics and Hispanic Protestants, with Hispanic Catholics being much more Democratic leaning. But one thing to note among the Latino population is there's a kind of trends that we've been tracking in the last couple of decades, and that is that the predominant first generation immigrants tend to be Catholic, and then second and third generation tend to be less Catholic. But they're actually going in two directions. So they're some of them are converting to Protestantism, becoming a bit more conservative, more likely to vote Republican. Others, though, are actually becoming religiously unaffiliated and claiming no religious affiliation. They tend to actually be more democratic. So even though there's this kind of trajectory happening, becoming less Catholic over time, more Protestant, more unaffiliated, the kind of needle doesn't move that much because it's happening almost in equal part. The political needle doesn't move that much because it's happening almost in equal in equal parts, Protestant Catholic, but Hispanic Catholics, tend to vote 3/4 or more for Democratic candidates typically, while Hispanic Protestants are more divided in their vote choices.
Here's another wonky question. Do you have any insights into the selection effects? People with these views find each other in a group with shared views versus indoctrination effects. So in other words, I guess, to what extent is it what folks are hearing in their congregations from their religious leaders, or to what extent is it people who share certain, a racist worldview who happen to find themselves or choose to congregate in the same congregation?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Obviously, these are difficult things to untangle from a statistical point of view. But I think it's a bit of both, and I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the remarkable findings in the book, when I was looking at contemporary public opinion, is that when I look down inside of regional effects, one of the things that happened was that we see, not surprisingly, like so what religious group white Christian group is providing are accounting for the most racist attitudes among whites in the South, not surprisingly, white evangelicals. But what it looks like is happening is that actually the group in the Midwest, for example, that is providing kind of that home is not white evangelicals. It's actually white mainline Protestants. And the similar thing for the Northeast. It's actually not white evangelicals in the Northeast. It's actually white Catholics and a combination of white Catholics and white mainline Protestants in the Northeast. So what it looks like is that the dominant Christian structure that's in place in the culture is the one that essentially serves as the home for, in many cases, kind of gathering more people who share these views. But at the same time, the way institutions work, and I think this is really important, that Americans are very likely to say, or to think about racism as a personal issue. That is, if all the racist people die, racism will go away. But that's not really the way institutions work. So what happens then is that when they get inside these institutions that have a kind of white supremacist worldview built into them, it actually strengthens those presuppositions that brought them there to in the first place. As they're around more like-minded people, they're studying in a way that has nothing that would challenge that. In fact, strengthens those presuppositions. So I think it's a bit of both. That I had a line in the book where I say, look, it's all, when you look at the data, it's almost as if you kind of said, okay, there was kind of a cartel arrangement where white evangelicals said, okay, we'll volunteer, we'll take the role of kind of playing this role of connecting this worldview of white supremacy with Christianity and legitimizing it in the wider culture. We'll do that in the South. White Catholics said, yep, okay, great, we'll take that in the Northeast. And then the white mainline basically said, yeah, and we'll work in the Northeast with you, and we'll also take the Midwest. That's what the data looks like. Of course, nothing overt like that happened, but I think that's what the data tends to look like. It's a very strong kind of both and, that I think people are attracted to them there for what they see, and then once they're there, those views get strengthened.
Could you give a few more examples of the kinds of questions? I think you mentioned one question, which was whether an incident like what happened to George Floyd was part of a pattern or kind of a one-off. Can you give examples of other questions that you pose to respondents to I guess you called it, to measure their racism index?
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who have the book, it's in chapter 5, page 167, 168. So there were questions about Confederate symbols, questions about Confederate monuments, and again, the monuments question was like a question about whether you see these more symbols of Southern pride or more symbol of racism. There were other questions about economic mobility. So like this one, generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Blacks to work their way out of the lower class. These are agree, disagree questions. Another one, it's really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If Blacks would only try harder, they could they could be just as well off as whites. Another one kind of brings immigration into it. Irish, Italians, Jews, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any special favors. Racial minorities use racism as an excuse more than they should. White people in the U.S. have certain advantages because of the color of their skin. I've already mentioned the killing of African American men by police one. One on the death penalty. A Black person is more likely than a white person to receive the death penalty for the same crime. And some general questions about I'm fearful of people of other races. Racial problems in the U.S. are rare, isolated incidents. And one on so-called reverse discrimination. Today, discrimination against whites has become as big a problem as discrimination against Blacks and other minorities. I didn't read everything, but there's 15 questions there that are built, for those of you interested in the how the sausage is made. They're built actually from a fairly long set of questions that have been developed in the social sciences to try to measure racism, which is, as you can imagine, is a tricky thing. And I particularly tried to move these towards structural racism because that's really what I was interested in, less about feeling warmly toward other African Americans. And in fact, I find those questions fairly useless. I actually demonstrate in the book that white evangelicals, for example, are one of the groups that score the highest on what's called a feeling thermometer score. So if you just ask people how warmly or coolly do you feel toward certain people groups, they score very, very high on feeling warmly toward African Americans. But then when you ask any of these structural racism questions, they also score the highest on this racism index that is kind of opposing anything around or refusing to see structural racism. So both of these things are actually true. I think that's instructive for us that they feel warmly toward African Americans, but on most policies that might actually help the structural racism thing, they either don't see it or oppose it. And these two things are true at the same time.
What do you think changed your own understanding of the worldview that you grew up with and now clearly find problematic? What was your moment? What is it? Road on the Damascus moment?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, the road to Damascus. I can't say that I had something like that. So I'm 52 years old. I was in my early 20s when I first even had any sense of this history, from this moment in a Baptist history class. And so it's been, I think, a long road. One way of saying this, so it's been 30 years, right? From that moment, that epiphany moment that sort of just opened the window a little bit and kind of let the light in to it kind of working its way out in me. One thing I can say is that my parents, who grew up in Jim Crow, Macon, Georgia, I think did me a great favor, and they actually, I think, did some work with me and my siblings. They weren't activists, they weren't that political, but they clearly, put some distance between us and that Jim Crow worldview that they grew up in. I think made some very deliberate decisions, even with how our grandparents talked to us or how our older relatives down in Macon talked to us when we were there visiting. And so I think that also made a difference. And because I noticed that, as a kid, again, it was kind of there and did some work. But I really think the last 5 years were what really made me put pen to paper. I mentioned Trayvon Martin. The other two, I think, big events that have probably been turning points, and for many folks, I certainly heard that as I was writing, are Charleston, Dylan Roof, murdering 9 African Americans in Mother Emanuel AME Church with the very intent of starting a race war. And in the book, I talk a little bit about Dylan Roof because the thing that didn't really get reported with Dylan Roof is that he was a Lutheran in good standing at his local church. So he was no stranger to Christianity. And in fact, in his journals, when he was in prison awaiting trial, after he'd been arrested, he was in prison awaiting trial. He was writing, his kind of white supremacist manifesto, calling on, hoping and saying that he hoped that what he was doing was going to start a race war. That was actually admitted into evidence in his trial. But what didn't get much attention is that all along the way he's writing this text, he is illustrating his journal with Christian symbols. So there's more than a dozen crosses doodled in the margins, and then there are a whole page. There's a whole page with a cross with rain falling. There's another whole page, and one I replicate in the book and reproduce in the book is a very detailed drawing that shows quite a deal of knowledge, actually, of Christian iconography, of a white Jesus stepping out of the tomb, and that takes up a whole page in his journal. And even in his own personal, he designed his own kind of white supremacist personal logo. And again, not a lot of commentary on this, but his logo, the centerpiece of his logo is a cross. And in the quadrants made by the cross, he has white supremacist symbols in each of the four quadrants of the cross. So in his person, he saw this as all very consistent. There was no dissonance in him. And I think it's easy to dismiss him as, sort of a crazy person, a rogue. But I really think we need to ask the question more clearly. Why was it that that was so easy for him? Why was it that there wasn't more dissonance there, that he could actually, tie these things together so clearly? So these things, I think, were markers along the way. Charlottesville, I think of, people chanting these neo-Nazi slogans and, shouting at Black reporters, "You will not replace us," saying Jews will not replace us, blood and soil. I mean, just this overt, thing there. And a very tepid response, I think, from white Christian communities on that, and a refusal to call the president out, I think, when he was very ambivalent in his own response to those things. So I think all of that, plus I think the police shootings, along the way, for Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor, other folks this year, I think all of that has sort of like been part of what's pushed me to put pen to paper, and then just realizing that there's really been no accounting for the role that, I think white Christian churches love to claim their place, as kind of the supports of the moral fiber of the country. I think, all right, well, let's take that seriously too. It also means that white Christian churches have been, as I described in the book, like the central tent pole, holding up this worldview that really had white supremacy at its core.
I have a few questions about the reaction to your book. So, and I'll ask the few that there are. Where have you been speaking to congregations in the South? Have you been presenting your book, and what has been their reaction? Or in general, what's been reaction from the communities whom you are, essentially calling out, right? And also whether you've received any death threats around your talks.
Yeah, well, so far I'm happy to say no death threats. Certainly plenty of angry phone calls, thousands of angry emails. So that part, I think we've been, kind of monitoring, and, I think are not that surprising. This is clearly a nerve, and if taken seriously, I mean, the call for moving to repair, and that part of repentance is costly, right? It's going to cost institutions to look at their endowments. It's going to cost individual people looking at their kind of at their own finances and their own commitments going forward. So it's about money, it's about power. So I think it's not that surprising. Hasn't been any, I think, big institutional responses. The Catholic League that Bill Donahue runs has kind of put out a couple of statements, but it's been, I think, kind of what you'd expect from the expected quarters. I will say that, though, that probably I don't know, 5 or 10 to 1, the responses have actually been, positive. And from, individuals, I got actually from Illinois, I got an email, this past week from a woman in Southern Illinois in a small, she says literally one traffic light town. And that she and she's white and in her 70s, and that she and her other, about a dozen other church members are, out at their one stoplight with their Black Lives Matter signs, standing there as a witness and tying it to their church, like standing there as a witness on behalf of their all white church, saying that Black Lives Matter. So I think those little things certainly give me a lot of hope. In the South, so far, I mean, I've done a piece at the national. This coming week, I'm speaking at the Atlanta History Center. I did a talk at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History that was kind of a mixed audience. And again, I think some hostile questions, but I think for the most part, the history is fairly clear, and so I think it's just there's not a lot of denial there. That will stand up to much scrutiny anyway. But I think this where the rubber meets the road, I think, is again the kind of call for a real sense of repentance. And we'll see, I think, if that gets any traction. We're seeing some of that. I mean, the Episcopalian denomination, both one of their seminaries, Episcopal denomination, and their bodies in Virginia, have actually set aside multi-million-dollar reparations funds. I mean, there are some beginnings of some movements that I think have some real teeth to them. And I hope to see more of that.
Here's a question: whether you see perhaps a correlation, association between racist attitudes and attitudes vis-a-vis immigration. Is there? Look for that.
Yeah, that's really important, because one of the things I was as I was doing the research was kind of wondering this myself: is this all about a kind of otherness, right? Othering, so would it equally apply to African Americans as to immigrants? And they're certainly related. But what's interesting, and I was actually kind of surprised by this. So in addition to this index on racist attitudes, I also built a 19-question index on immigration attitudes. And not surprisingly, those hold together quite well. And I put them in the model. They're actually in the model, the regression model, with these racial attitudes questions, because one of the things I wanted to see is if I control for immigration attitudes, do these attitudes just go away? In other words, are they co-related as to be non-distinct? And it turns out that even with the control for anti-immigrant attitudes in the model, these kind of racist attitudes toward African Americans actually stand up as something distinct. Now, they go in the same direction, but what the models show is that they're actually kind of vectors that kind of run parallel but aren't conflated with each other. So I think it's a kind of both and attitudes. They're certainly distinct. And that I think is instructive and interesting, and worth kind of paying attention to today. That again, I think they're just that they don't completely collapse into one another.
Here's a question about where do you place Christian leaders such as Jim Wallis? His book, America's Original Sin, provides an interpretation of Christianity that is anti-racist. I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds like you are. Could you elaborate and tell us what you think?
Sure. I'll say this about certainly. So I know Jim well, and he was one of the early, leaders from the white Christian world, really putting it out there, I think, and that the book America's Original Sin, and calling it America's Original Sin. He's been very, very consistent. I mean, he wrote something, I don't know, either this week or last week, very clearly even saying, this question of racial justice is on the ballot, and is in fact, the key, question for, and that white Christians are facing, this as a question on the ballot. So he's been calling attention to this quite consistently for some time. I think it's been important. I mean, his audience, I think, is kind of, moderate evangelical to conservative mainline Protestants. And I think in some ways, we thought of those folks as being at least somewhat the choir, but I think this new data, from the book shows that that's not really the case at all. It's worth remembering that put it this way, just in political context, that it has been true since Reagan. If you wanted to describe the American religious context in terms of voting, voting patterns, that you could, with a high degree of accuracy, say this. You could say that, really since Reagan, white Christians, and that includes mainline Catholic and evangelical, have voted majority for Republican candidates, while everyone else, Christians of color, non-Christian religious folks, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, et cetera, and those who claim no religious affiliation, have all voted for Democratic candidates, and that pattern has remained true. It shifted hardly at all with President Trump, and I think that was maybe one of the biggest surprises, that it didn't shift with Trump as a very atypical candidate in 2016. But just to kind of put this on the radar, I think the number everyone may know from the news is that about 8 in 10 white evangelicals voted for Trump. But I think the numbers that people don't know so well is that 64% of white Catholics and 57% of white mainline Protestants also voted for President Trump in 2016. And so that alignment has been there, and really the way we get that alignment is from the civil reactions to the Civil Rights Acts in the mid 1960s. Prior to that, most of those white Christian groups were Democrats.
One listener says, I have a growing awareness and fondness for James Baldwin this last decade. What work or speech would you recommend for someone starting to explore more of his work?
Yeah, I'm going to recommend one contemporary thing, just because it's new and out from a colleague of mine, and maybe you may have seen it. It's actually been on the bestseller list, so you probably have seen it or at least heard about it. It's a new sort of interesting. It's not quite a biography, but of Baldwin, but it's called Begin Again by Eddie Glaude, and Eddie is a professor at Princeton. In religion and African American studies. It's an amazing piece, and it's a great, I think, guide and companion to actually reading Baldwin himself, because Eddie, I think, puts it in the contemporary context so well. So I think helping to see the relevance. I mean, there's obviously The Fire Next Time, I think, is just an amazing piece to begin with. But the other one I'd recommend that's maybe less, this is a sort of later piece, is No Name in the Street, which is a collection of writings as well. Might be the other place I would go for the nonfiction, things. But it is, I mean, he was absolutely a sort of guiding light for me, and I think both stiffening my spine and I think providing insight here. I want to take this opportunity actually to quickly read a quote from him that comes actually from an op-ed he wrote, because it is the title of the book. So I want to make sure I didn't get this in the comments, but so the book's called White Too Long, and it really is a response. One way I think reading my book is to try to be a response to Baldwin's really indictments of whites in the white Christian community. So this quote comes from late in the after Martin Luther King has been assassinated, Bobby Kennedy's been assassinated. And he's writing this, I think, from a great moment of despair, because he, like King, thought that the whites overall, and that white Christians in particular, would finally see this cause of justice in the civil rights movement, and would finally stand up. He's writing this, I think, after King's been assassinated. This is from a New York Times op-ed just a few months after King's assassination. He says this: I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me, and has so impressed me for a very long time, as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They have been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. The effect on their personalities, their lives, their grasp of reality has been as devastating as the lava which so memorably immobilized the citizens of Pompeii. They are unable to conceive that their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history and a parody of theirs and an intolerable violation of myself.
It was wonderful to hear some examples of, I guess you would characterize it as reparative work between a white congregation and a Black congregation. And you've emphasized the importance of repair coming before reconciliation. Can you say more about, I guess, how you envision repair and what, I guess, specifically you would see congregations doing? I mean, some have an endowment, obviously some don't. So tell us more about repair.
Yeah. Well, I think this is also something that I've become much more clearer on, is that I think the vast majority of certainly out of the evangelical world and even from well-meaning white Christians, I think has come under the heading of racial reconciliation. And I'm at least calling on the book to hopefully retire that term and to talk about racial justice or racial repair, because I think that's so much more fundamental. But I think the equation has been this: white apology and lament plus Black forgiveness equals reconciliation. I think that's been the formula that most white Christians have been operating with. And obviously nowhere in that is any deep sense of repairing the damage, and similar word, reparations. And so I think doing that work has got to be the goal. And then again, I think reconciliation can come as an organic outgrowth of that. But I think we're seeing it again. These, a couple places, Virginia Theological Seminary has set aside $1.7 million. The Episcopal Church, I think, is taking this very seriously and trying to find ways to do it. But even in Macon, these two Baptist churches, I mean, the white church is in a much better financial position than the African American church there. And the white pastor said, "Look, this is something we're really going to have to talk about." I mean, we were clearly, literally, that congregation was built, with enslaved people's labor. And so there's a very real way in which the line is very straight. It's not even a dotted line there. But I think that's what it's going to have to come to, and it can also come with policy changes. I think white Christians really getting behind affirmative action, getting behind other kinds of policies, criminal justice reform, where we see clear racial disparities in the outcomes of the law or the way the law is being applied, and paying really close attention to that. I mean, in bigger cities, for sure, you can see, like in Chicago, for example, I mean, you can see the legacy of redlining, this practice of designating, certain neighborhoods as white and certain neighborhoods as Black, even today, and in most major cities in the country. And so if you ask congregations, why are they located where they are? That question is going to go to race pretty quickly, if they've been around for any time at all. And even if they're new and they're out in the suburbs, the question is going to be, well, why this suburb? And why do we make the decision to locate here? Often that's a white flight. The honest answer to that is white flight. We came out here because this is where white people were fleeing the city. And so if that's the case, and you sort of, benefited from that, how do you start asking the honest questions of what responsibility do we have then, having benefited from these structural things? So I think it can be a lot of different things. It doesn't have to just be a straight cash transfer. But I do think it should. That's absolutely something has to be on the table as well. But I think this will come as I think white Christians in particular, and really whites of all goodwill, become clearer about the direct connections here. I think that this history has been so repressed and suppressed, out of self-interest, but I'm hoping that at this point only a willful ignorance can really prevail here, and that people of goodwill will really start to ask these questions. And once the history becomes clearer, then I think we're in a place where these questions seem less hostile, right? They seem to be something that one does out of love instead of out of obligation.
And our final question, I'll let you make a plug for your organization, PRRI. Tell us more about it, how you are supported financially, and anything else you want to share.
Great. Well, PRRI, again, stands for Public Religion Research Institute. We're nonprofit, nonpartisan, independent research organization. We do research at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. So predominantly what we do is we do public opinion survey data, and we provide this to journalists to help them tell better stories. That is really our primary reason to be, is to support independent journalism, and so that journalists can write less on conjecture and more on facts. And we can help illuminate things that you can see that, I think some of the power of it in this data, and also help, I think, point out where there's a gap between claims and reality in public opinion. Here, we also track demographic trends in the country. Have a big so coming up. I guess two things you can look for on the short term is a big demographic mapping of the country all the way down to the county level, religious affiliation down to the county level, which has never really been done in any sort of rigorous way. And then we have our annual, as will be our 11th annual American Values Survey that we conduct every year in partnership with the Brookings Institution here in DC. So on October 19th, we will be releasing our big pre-election survey that will look at these issues: immigration, COVID-19, all the kind of major factors that are playing into the election, and then look at it by party and religion to see what we can understand about the lay of the land, kind of going down the home stretch of the election. If any of you were kind of religion, culture, politics junkies, we have a newsletter that's out multiple times a week called the Morning Buzz. That the subline is news with a shot of data. So we kind of take the headlines and wrap good public opinion data around it with this kind of religion, culture lens on it. So we'd be happy to have any of you sign up there. And we're primarily funded by foundation grants. We're about 90% foundation funded by many large foundations. The Joyce Foundation, actually there in Chicago, has been a supporter of ours. Kresge Foundation, McKnight Foundation up in the Upper Midwest, and then more national foundations, Carnegie, Ford, and others. So that's mostly how we're funded, is through foundation grants and about 10% individual donations.
Thank you so much, Robert, for this incredibly stimulating and timely conversation. We really, really appreciate it. If you're able to Zoom into our coffee and continue conversation, please do, although it's also understandable that if you've had your fill of being in a box. So thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of this Sunday. And I will close with a quote. This is by Robert Ingersoll, 19th century American writer and orator who was known as the Great Agnostic. Happiness is the only good. The time to be happy is now. The place to be happy is here. The way to be happy is to make others so. Have a wonderful Sunday. Join us for coffee and join us again next Sunday.